Greetings adventurers, and welcome to the Loot Goblin Marketplace. When a new player comes into a campaign and assumes their style is the right way, it can definitely be frustrating. Just remember that sometimes the player is just being overly eager. We all start playing TTRPGs for different reasons. Now occasionally you might get someone who saw a Let's Play and treats how that campaign ran like gospel, and demands you change the game to fit that style, which is no better than the gatekeeping I see bashed in online discourse whenever a dungeon master tries to impose their preferred way of play on their players. The reality is everyone likes their games played a little differently, and being unable to incorporate the entire table's preference doesn't make you an authority in the TTRPG space, it just makes you difficult. But before we begin, this video is brought to you by Apotheosis, a fantasy sci-fi role-playing game where it's your actions, not your class, that determines how you level up. Apotheosis features a classless character creation system, meaning that you get to shape your character the way you want. Build any playstyle you can imagine, no limits. Want to be a wizard with a gun? A space explorer with superhuman strength? You've got it. The progression system in Apotheosis ensures that your character is fully customizable, with it being intentionally modular to allow for easy homebrewing and expansion. You'll find very quickly, if you're familiar with the D20 system like Dungeons & Dragons, that you can easily port over your favorite feats and items from your previous campaigns. There are some familiar and some unique species in Apotheosis. You can play a dwarf or human if you're looking for a sci-fi spin on a classic, but if you're looking for something different, the Vonoi, a species of robots that can reconfigure themselves to optimize for their current circumstances, might be exactly what you're looking for in your next campaign. Plus, Apotheosis offers a free character creation app for Android devices. It's ad-free, microtransaction-free, and always free to use. Plus, there's a free-to-join Discord community for fans. Connect with fellow players, share stories, and get tips from the pros. Visit apotheosisrpg.com using the link in the description to get 20% off your choice of the core rulebooks. That includes a sci-fi or fantasy version, and dive into the world of Apotheosis today. Today's treasure goes by the name, have you ever played Warhammer? No? Then shut up after a D&D session. It's probably not the worst story that you've read here, but I just need to rant. This story starts with my best friend N joining an online D&D one-shot and telling me about it. Now, I'm a forever dungeon master, and as soon as my friends tell me about his game, I ask if he may be able to get me a spot too. The dungeon master tells him no, as he already has 4 players and 5 players were too much to handle. This will be relevant later. I say alright, that's perfectly reasonable, and go on without thought, but not before asking my friend to invite me to this public D&D Discord that he used to find the game. Some time passes and I'm on that Discord lurking around in search of a game to join. To my surprise, the same dungeon master posts again that 2 spots were opened, and I messaged him asking to join. He says yes, and I start to prepare my character. Shortly after, he sends me a lot of links to make my character online, stuff like Token Stamp 2.0, a list of magic items, a point buy simulator, and etc. Which surprises me because his post on Discord asked for only experienced players, but I didn't really care, so I said in response, and I quote, "Thanks, I wanted to ask a couple of questions about the one-shot if you don't mind." In response, he sends me the same links again. Alright, I'll ask anyway. Do you mind strong characters? I'm not going to power play, but if the session is going to be about combat, then I will likely make a strong player character since I'm planning for a fighter. He sends me the links again without answering my question. Alright, pretty weird, but hey, maybe he's busy, I'm not going to bother him. The day the session comes, and after a very brief introduction of each player character, we immediately get an info dump with multiple handouts. We were playing on Roll20, which is weird because the Discord post didn't mention much about the background, just that we were defending a military cemetery from an undead wizard that wanted to raise the soldiers as his army. I'm going to list all the odd/bad things about the session, which lasted 4 hours. The only relevant info about the player characters was that we were level 8, and one of the players was using a Bear Totem Barbarian, which halves all damage except Psychic. I find out that there are 6 players in the session, and the Dungeon Master says he's used to running sessions with 10 players. Odd. All roleplay is instantly shut down. The Bard wanted to scare a couple of children who were hanging around the Bad District, and they pretty much ignored him. In the first 15 minutes, we were introduced to about 6 named non-player characters, 3 factions, and the name of a couple cities, and the name of the big bad evil guy. This is a one-shot, might I remind you. After 15 minutes, we got into a combat which lasted just shy of 4 hours. A single combat. At the start start of the round, my player character isn't able to shoot at an army of skeletons that is going to reach the cemetery in a round, even if my range is 600 feet, and the Dungeon Master confirms time and time again that we were able to see them. The first half of the combat is wasted fighting these 20 skeletons. Each had 18 AC and more than 50 HP, and the only thing that they did was attack from melee. At the time, there was about 6 NPCs that also act, making each round last an eternity. The Dungeon Master tries to argue that the barbarian should take full damage from the skeleton strikes as they're magical, but all 6 of us argue back, and he backs off, at least it seems so at first. At the start of the second half of the combat, around 2 hours in, 5 undead golems rise from the ground, and 2 named NPCs plus 5 NPC soldiers arrive from the other side. One of the named NPCs, on a griffin, instantly kills an undead golem, while the other named NPC, a captain, attacks 3 times in a turn with a bonus that puts his stats above 20, or maybe his level's insanely high. At this point, 8 skeletons still remain, most of which are all still untouched. After another full hour, the big bad evil guy appears, and is instantly stopped in place by 3 named NPCs that keep him occupied while we slowly chip away at the remaining skeletons. Yes, they were still alive and golems. Finally, after another full hour, we bring down the big bad evil guy, and as a final FU, he explodes, dealing psychic damage, coincidentally downing the barbarian. Now isn't that convenient? We get back to the quest giver, which we find out is an undead, and every attempt to attack him is thwarted by the Dungeon Master saying the light comes from the window and kills him. Okay. Ah yes, I too enjoy 4 hours of combat followed by forced cutscene cinematic battles. And the fact that he lore dumps so much named NPCs and factions to something that's going to be a one-shot with a 4-hour time limit, it feels like he's kind of playtesting how he wants his campaign to go in either another campaign, or maybe he's writing a book and he's like, no. The twist of the quest giver being undead is super important, and you're not going to be told why the light comes in and kills them, but there's like some god and some extended lore, and in another part of the backstory, this would totally make sense, but I'm not going to explain it to you. Overall, definitely a frustrating list of things. I know the title doesn't seem to be related directly to what happened so far in the game, so I'm going to let the story continue, but I just wanted to say to the author of the story, you can tell this guy was running a one-shot to get a lot of stuff out of it personally, and yeah, he didn't really seem to value any of the players' agency or time, so that totally sucks. Let's see what happens after though. Now the session is done, and after I ask politely to give him some feedback, and that I honestly did not enjoy the game, trying to explain my points without sounding rude at any point. I even asked my friend to message me if he thought I was stepping over the line, and even he said that I was very polite. I told him that having so many tanky enemies and DMPCs ruined the combat, and that I spent less than an hour of the 4-hour period actually playing, and most of the time I was just waiting for my turn. In response, he rudely tells me, "Your first mistake was giving feedback. I've been a Dungeon Master for 4 years, and I know what I'm doing. What was your first TTRPG?" I'm slightly annoyed by his attitude, but I answer that I've been playing and dungeon mastering Dungeons & Dragons for 3 years, and that I started out with D&D. He then says, "Well, whatever. Do you know how much time it took to organize this session? More than a week," which was most likely a lie, since I always see him posting on Discord new one-shots, and he used a map he found online and literally 6 tokens in total. He continued rambling for a while. When asked why he took a whole week to prepare the one-shot, he said a bunch of things about balancing and how Wizards of the Coast doesn't know how to make fights fair, which, by the way, is true only when talking about weird abilities like save or suck stuff, i.e. basilisks. All the enemies did in this one-shot was attack and soak damage, which is something that the CR system can perfectly represent, making your job as a Dungeon Master extremely easy. He kept going on, saying that the reason for all the DMPCs was that the one-shot was made for 10 players, Jesus Christ, just put less enemies, and that he never had a TPK, which is odd because in my experience, having absolutely no TPK in 4 years of experience, not even accidental ones, means that you are mostly playing the same stuff over and over. I admit that I started losing my patience and reaching my tipping point. Dungeon Master: "Well, do you know why I made a one-shot like this? If you knew how to play Warhammer..." Me: "Well, I do know how to play Warhammer, which is not really relevant to Dungeons & Dragons. Playing D&D like it's an army game is akin to squaring a circle, which is something I found out the hard way when I had to cancel my first campaign because I extremely mismanaged a war, and it was becoming a slog for me to plan and play." Dungeon Master stays silent, and so does the author. Dungeon Master: "Well, I bet that you're you're not a professional player. And then he went on. Shortly after I apologized, said goodnight, and went offline. My friend apologized to me later because he thought it was his fault that we had to play this awful session. We laughed a bit about how awful it was and forgot about the one-shot shortly after. After this, I was so salty that I put on back my forever Dungeon Master hat and started hosting my own one-shots on the same server, making sure that I accepted feedback while making fun and interactive encounters, both combat and not, for my players. And thus concludes the story. I think the author is going to have an uphill battle whenever you give advice after your first session with someone, especially someone who is running a one-shot. There's probably a reason why this guy isn't in a consistent campaign. If he prides himself on being a Dungeon Master of 4 years, and when you ask him what his longest running session is, he's like, I kind of just do one-shots now, it might be a tell that he's kind of difficult and a lot of players don't want to stick around. I wouldn't read in too much about the fact that he said that there can only be 4 players and then he ended up extending it to 6. This seems like a guy who maybe is a little all over the place. When someone brought up, hey, can I bring in one of his friends? He shuts it down immediately and says, no, I decide how many people there are. A little bit of a controlling thing, but the fact they let you in after the fact probably either means he didn't realize it was the same person or he just kind of was all over the place with this one shot. I do think it's funny though that this guy basically prides himself as a war gamer, but then feels like D&D is too hard to balance. I don't know what this elitism is that people look down upon people who only play D&D, but then they always seem to do D&D because it's just the easiest. I feel like it's a bit of a bell curve where the beginners, they always get mocked for playing D&D, and then the veterans, they just have D&D in their back pocket because they're like, look, I want to run something, I want it to be easy, and I know that most people know the system. Let's just start there. We can homebrew, we can do other stuff as time goes on, but it's just safe to pick D&D, you know? So him playing it, kind of resenting playing it, and then looking down on you for playing it first is kind of weird. You really can't be in the TTRPG hobby and pretend Dungeons and Dragons doesn't exist. If you want to play with a wide variety of players, by all means, reach out, get people to expand their horizons, try out other games, but don't be surprised when they say, oh yeah, I played D&D and a little bit of Pathfinder first edition. It's just going to be the case more times than not, right? This is just someone who wanted to be elitist and dismiss your argument before it even began. It's like, he probably started playing D&D, he only knows that system. I played true systems. I'm a war gamer after all. Just your typical control freak style dungeon master who clearly only goes on the forums and looking for group sections because he cannot hold a party to save his life. And while there's nothing inherently wrong with using these forums, I recommend it for new players. I would also recommend you guys networking and finding friends, like the author tried to do in this story, to find good groups. Because truth be told, you don't know what you're getting when you're dealing with strangers on the internet. They could be an RPG horror story waiting to happen. So keep that in mind, and I hope you guys enjoyed this shorter story. You can share the video, like and subscribe, and just help the channel grow by commenting your thoughts of this story. I'm always curious to hear what you guys have to say, and I hope to see you guys in the next video. Farewell for now.